Monster Hunter is known for its boss fights. Whether you're a fan of the slower, more methodical encounters of the older generations, or the faster, more reactive fights of the modern games, we are all drawn in by the idea of fighting these fantastical creatures. But every now and again, you'll come across a monster that really pushes the line of what you're willing to put up with, from what already feels like an uphill battle. From smaller things like bad hitboxes and questionable game mechanics to outrageous amounts of monotony and bloat that makes you wonder if the developers even played their own game. Welcome to Worst Monster Ever, a series where I take you on a journey across the Monster Hunter franchise to try and find the best and the worst monsters this series has to offer. And today, we're going to be talking about one of the oldest monsters to ever plague the series, one that's been frustrating players since way back in 2004. Gravios is a flying wyvern who's been around since the very first Monster Hunter game, making him as old as the likes of Rathalos and his whore of a wife. Yet he shares none of the fame that his peers have. At a first glance, his fight has a lot of what you would expect from a typical Gen 1 wyvern. He's got the charge attack, a tailspin, and a bite. He's even able to fly, funnily enough, which you wouldn't really expect from a monster that's built like this. Granted, he's not very good at it, but maybe it looks good on a resume or something, I don't fucking know. The most defining moves in his kit give him the ability to release gas from his chest that can either damage the player with fire or put the player to sleep, leaving them vulnerable to a follow-up attack. And of course he has his iconic Heat Ray, a map-wide laser beam that can even hit through walls, giving him a bit of zoning power. But what makes Gravios so frustrating to fight has less to do with his moveset and more to do with the unorthodox way you're supposed to fight him. Normally the best way at dealing with wyverns in the older games is to exploit their rudimentary behaviors to target their heads and tails, or crippling them with tools like flash bombs. It's why head sniping and flash locking was so popular back in the day. Since most monsters shared similar movesets and physiology with one another, it also meant they shared a lot of the same vulnerabilities as far as player strategy was concerned. Gravios, on the other hand, was an exception to the rule. His entire body is covered with armor that will cause the player to bounce off whenever they attack, hence why he's called the armor wyvern. Going for the head is actually one of the worst parts for you to target here, which throws a bit of a wrench in the gears since most weapons aren't used to fondling the shaft like an S&M main. In fact, Gravios doesn't have any good hit zones from the onset of the fight. Even the legs will have you bouncing off them until you reach higher sharpness levels later on. Instead, the game wants you to focus on emasculating the chest, which opens up a layer of flesh underneath that you can hit for big damage. But breaking the chest can still take a while though, and you need at least green sharpness to attack it without bouncing off, which is a pretty big ask since by the time you're first able to fight this thing, your sharpness economy is usually pretty low, and the amount of weapons that can provide a serviceable amount of green sharpness without needing constant maintenance are relatively scarce. Hanging around the chest also means you'll be taking considerable damage from his hip check and gas attacks, and with how long a Gravios hunt can take due to his bulkiness, the fight quickly ends up becoming a battle of attrition more often than not. So unless you're willing to spend 30 to 40 minutes chipping this thing down while he drains all your resources, you're gonna want to come in with a more sophisticated game plan. This is where novel tactics like sleep and trap bombing really come into the limelight. The cool thing about barrel bombs is that they deal fixed damage regardless of the hit zone it's targeting. So instead of spending 10 to 20 minutes trying to chip through the chest armor, it's a lot more efficient to immobilize the monster with a sleep weapon or a trap, so you can go full Uncle Ted on the guy. It's one of those preparation aspects that added a lot of flavor to Monster Hunter's combat design early on into the series, using whatever dirty tricks, tools, and techniques the hunter has in their arsenal to try and gain an advantage against an enemy that's way stronger than they are. Unfortunately though, there are times where these games will be at odds with themselves, and the planned counterplay the monster was designed around doesn't really work as planned. There's a pretty infamous quest early on in Freedom Unite that I'm sure most old heads are familiar with, where you have to fight a Gravios in the swamp in order to progress the Gathering Hub. And what's evil about this quest in particular is that it's raining, and when it's raining in the swamp, your barrel bombs don't work. I guess society within the Monster Hunter world hasn't regressed far enough to facilitate the need for an anarchist cookbook, so the idea of a bomb with an internal fuse is probably still a novelty to these people. But for all intents and purposes, bombs are off the table for this fight. Instead, they give you these little lightning rods that'll redirect a bolt of lightning to wherever you put them down. They're not nearly as effective as barrel bombs though, and I don't think they can actually break the chest. I've seen full parties pelt this guy with like 50 lightning bolts and never getting the chest to break, so in practical use they're pretty worthless. So what the hell are you supposed to do against this thing then? You can't use bombs, your weapon is barely effective against it. Even the Wrath of God isn't strong enough to break through his defense. I guess you're just fucked here, aren't you? Well, fortunately, there is one last solution. In response to the rise of the Gravios menace, mankind channeled their frustration into developing a weapon of mass destruction. A weapon so diabolical, so full of hatred and vitriol, that many fear to even remember its name. I am of course referring to the almighty lobster gun. This crustaceous caliber is a pretty interesting weapon that you can get early on in the game. It's a light bow gun with the ability to rapid fire water ammo, which is a very powerful ability to have in Freedom Unite since every elemental shot has low recoil in this game, with Dragon being the only exception. And most elemental shots are also able to pierce through the monster to hit multiple times. So as you can imagine, bringing a weapon like this to a big monster who's deathly weak to water like Gravios, the fight becomes a bit trivial, doesn't it? You're a gunner, so you don't have to worry about your weapon bouncing, and you also don't have to worry about his close range attacks since you're usually standing outside their reach. But regardless of what strategy you use to take it down, I don't think it really changes how boring Gravios is to fight in these early generations. With how his armor mechanic is set up, pretty much every weapon gets funneled into the same general strategy regardless of their weapon's individual strengths, which is just focusing on the chest. And while I do enjoy strategies like sleep bombing, they really are just a means to an end here. You spend the whole hunt attacking the chest so that you can deal more damage as you continue attacking the chest. The mechanics of the fight haven't really changed much, you just get a bigger number for doing the thing that you've already been doing for the past 15 minutes. And it's not as interesting as something like head sniping, where there's an element of preemptiveness and timing involved. Gravios is slow and bulky, so you spend most of the fight wailing on him and chasing him down whenever he decides to run across the map. It's incredibly mind-numbing and monotonous, even by Monster Hunter standards. Of course, there's also the Black Gravios, a Gravios subspecies. There's not much to say about the guy. He comes from an era where Capcom's design philosophy for subspecies is to just take the most annoying traits a monster has and make them even more annoying. Black Gravios is no exception to this. Now his armor is even harder than it was before, and not even your green sharpness will be enough to save you. So if you haven't switched over to Gunner already, you'll definitely want to consider it now. Now unfortunately Gravios wasn't able to join us in the 3rd generation, and frankly I don't blame the guy. After all, he's a monster with a crippling weakness to water, and if the 3rd generation was known for anything, it was for getting wet and messy. I mean, the poor guy can't even handle a lobster on land. You think he stands a chance on its home turf? You drop a Gravios down here, he'll get demolished. Death by 1,000 lobsters, as they say. I guess it just goes to show that sometimes being an apex predator means knowing how to pick your battles. Which brings us to the 4th generation, and what is in my opinion the best iteration of Gravios we ever had, since his fight was reworked pretty heavily in these games. Most of his original moveset is still intact, and they gave him a new move where he shoots a bunch of smaller lasers that have surprisingly good tracking for a projectile. Especially in GU, I feel like I'm always getting hit by these things. They did remove his ability to fly, which I don't really mind since it was just a get off me move that only existed to waste a player's time. And Gravios already has plenty of moves for scattering players around, one of which being the flaming gas that he can release after using his laser. This was something he could do in the older generations, but it's a much more prominent threat in 4th gen with how frequently he uses it, especially in the later ranks. But the most interesting changes he received are his interactions with different part breaks. Before, the only parts you could break were his chest and tail. Now you can break just about everything. And most of those part breaks have a mechanical impact on the fight as well. Breaking his back attack will completely turn off his ability to release flaming gas after a laser beam. The heat will rise and disperse through the holes you created, which gives you way more safe openings to work on his chest. It also turns his back into a weak spot, and while it's not as meaty as a broken chest, it's a nice consolation prize in case he ends up toppling the wrong way. Breaking his legs will not only stop you from bouncing off them, but also give you a knockdown while making it easier to trip the monster for the rest of the fight. And breaking one of his wings will cause him to topple over whenever he uses his jump attack, giving you a small window to attack his chest or his back, depending on which side you're on. These are all great changes, I think, because they broaden the range of strategies the player can use to approach the fight, without removing the core idea of breaking through the monster's armor. While breaking the chest is still an important part of the fight, now it just feels like one step of a series of things the player can do to seize an advantage against the monster. If you want to maximize the time you have to hit the chest, you'll want to break the back, and if you want to break the back, you'll need a way to reach it. Using different strategies based on your weapon, like mounting, or tripping the monster by exploiting his other mechanics. Sleep bombing is also still a strong option here, both for breaking the chest and the back. There's a lot of room for skill expression once you understand how the mechanics work, but since the learning curve for the monster is much higher now, a lot of new players end up getting frustrated the first time they encounter him, but I don't think that's a bad thing. Part of what makes Monster Hunter such an interesting experience is the process of learning how each of these creatures work. The monsters generate friction against the player as a means to foster a deeper level of engagement with the fight, and it's because of that friction that it feels so satisfying when you finally get to the point of understanding and mastery, where you're not just overcoming the strengths of a monster that's been giving you a hard time, but actively using your knowledge and skill to push them onto the back foot. It's the lows that define the highs. And while we're on the subject of lows, I just want to complain about the absolute dog shit map you fight this thing in. The Volcanic Hollow is probably one of the worst maps to fight in across the whole series, and Gravios likes to spawn in the worst area of it. The inclines and ledges can make positioning really awkward and will often cause monsters to clip into the environment on knockdowns. And the monster will often wander into these large lava sections that are completely out of bounds for the player. I can't begin to tell you how many times I've been cock-blocked out of a mount because this asshole fell too close to the invisible wall near the lava. It's so fucking stupid. Speaking of stupid, look who's back. Black Gravios shares all the new mechanics as a regular Gravios, but with a few new moves in his arsenal. He has a new vertical laser beam that he'll sweep across the area twice, and another beam he can use as a turnaround attack. Both of these are map-wide attacks, so they can be pretty scary to deal with since they hit really hard.
Woo! Oh my god, these people just need to heal. Oh my god! So close! Damn you! Damn you, Ashton!
I do like them though, you just have to pay close attention and keep on the move. What's more annoying is that now, whenever he starts shooting his smaller projectiles, he'll release flaming gas every time he fires. And I feel like this specific move is where things have gone a bit too far. The monster already has really strong zoning abilities, so the counterplay should be about closing that gap. It works fine on regular Gravios because you can run underneath him and use his large body frame as cover. It's a clever weakness in his offense for you to exploit and to set yourself up in a position to counterattack. You can't do that with Black Gravios because he's constantly smoking out everything around him while he's firing at you, so you have to take a wide angle around him and wait for it to stop so you can continue with the fight. It's a stalling move now. Luckily you can turn the gas off by breaking the back, but since it's Black Gravios, his shell is harder and takes longer to break. Usually this thing doesn't crack until around the end of the fight, so you're stuck having to deal with this constant area denial slowly lumbering towards you while simultaneously being pressured from range, with no opportunity to set up for a counterattack. And it's just not very fun to deal with, especially if his target is something at the end of the map. All you can really do is sit on your hands and wait. It's a bit too perfect of a defense in my opinion. On a funnier note though, this Gravios actually is able to fly. It's a pretty rare move and I've never actually had it happen to me, but there is footage out there of him doing it. So watch out folks. This menace has his eyes set towards the skies.
He's flying like a... Well, he's too freaking fat to even fly. He's just gliding.
Finally, we arrive at the 6th generation with Monster Hunter Wilds, which is probably one of the most divisive generations, to put it nicely. In general, I don't think Wilds has handled returning monsters very well. Graphically, they can look pretty nice when the environment isn't dark and muddy, which it usually is most of the time, but in terms of boss design, they tend to fall flat more often than not, and unfortunately Gravios suffered pretty heavily this time around. On a positive note, they gave him the vertical beam that Black Gravios had, and it looks really nice here. He can also shoot the beam towards his legs, which feels kind of redundant, since he can already release different gases to push the player out. Speaking of which, Gravios gained the ability to release poison gas in this game. This was something he could actually do in Freedom Unite as an alleged bug during one of Netgoat's quests. Now it's a novel, albeit redundant, part of his kit, and they replace his tail spin with this new slow tail drag, which is neat, I guess. That's about all the good things I have to say about him, really. Like most other returning monsters, a lot of Gravios' mechanics were streamlined pretty heavily, starting with the wound system. In Wilds, monsters will often use moves that create temporary wounds for you to focus strike for big damage and a stagger. Wounds are already an incredibly broken mechanic in Wilds, and thankfully they're pretty moderate with the amount of temporary wounds a monster can have, but for some reason they really dropped the ball with Gravios. This thing has not 1, not 2, not 3, not 4, not 5, not 6, not 7, not 8. 9 temporary wound opportunities, and that's on top of the normal wounds created by the player. It's a miracle that this thing can wake up in the morning without breaking every bone in its body.
I've fallen, and I can't get up!
Gravios' part break interactions have also changed. Now you need to break both wings for him to topple after his jump attack. Breaking the back still prevents gas follow-ups from his laser, but it's heavily devalued in this game since the only attack that can have a gas follow-up is his straight laser beam, so you can kind of just foot the bill on it if it ever happens, assuming it happens. Also, I don't think I've ever actually broken this thing's back in normal gameplay. The only time I've ever seen it happen was from IGN's press coverage during the game's pre-release. This thing croaks before I ever get the chance, and the reason for that is because the chest is incredibly easy to break in this game, usually within the first minute or two of the hunt. It's ridiculous. So with all these changes, combined with the increased mobility and the insane damage output of the player, the actual fight plays out like most other fights in Wilds, where you just steamroll it with brute force and move on to the next victim. I've never felt the need to engage with his part break mechanics here because they're so inconsequential now, and it's easier and quicker to just break the chest early on and tear him to shreds. And it's not like you're starving for openings either, since he'll just give them to you for free on the regular. In a way, it kind of feels like I'm fighting a Zelda boss, where you're just waiting around for the big bad to blow its load before you shoot at its big glowing eyeball and go to town on the poor thing. Just substitute the glowing eyeball with a giant red rash. But maybe I'm being a bit too harsh here, since even the Zelda bosses have some sort of puzzle solving element involved. You can't just throw yourself at them and succeed like you can in this game. And it's a real shame, because I feel like the 4th gen Gravios really was emblematic of what made Monster Hunter's combat so interesting, where you're pitted against a monster who, by all measures, is much larger, stronger, and well guarded than you are. And it's up to you to use whatever tools you can in order to take it down. Whether that be traps, bombs, preparing the right weapon, everything is on the table, because the monster and its mechanics generate a certain level of friction against you that warranted the use of all these different approaches, not just in preparation, but in execution as well. And the more you understand the game, and the options available to you, and the more you understand the monster and the nuances that come with it, the easier it is to overcome that friction. This thing that was once frustrating to fight becomes incredibly satisfying as you figure out exactly what makes it tick. When you go out of your way to remove that friction, you also remove the mechanical depth that made the fight interesting in the first place, because you can just deal with it the same way you've dealt with everything else so far. It becomes homogenized and boring. What does Gravios do in Wilds? What's his identity? He shoots the funny laser beam and that's about it. This thing is supposed to be the armor wyvern. You're not gonna convince me of that when its armor breaks within the first minute of the hunt, and it starts bleeding anytime it tries to do anything. So is Gravios the worst monster ever? Well, he certainly had a rocky career, that's for sure. He went from being one of the most tedious fights in the older generations to a pretty tightly designed boss focused around part breaks in the 4th generation, until he fell off a ledge and became crippled in Wilds. It's been peaks and valleys for this guy. And while he doesn't measure up to some of the absolute legends this series has to offer, I don't think you could rank him among the worst either. There are some genuinely terrible monsters in these games that have never had a single high moment in their entire career, and maybe we'll get to talk about them one day. But you could do a lot worse than Gravios. At most you could call him a sellout. He did everything he could to be more hip and cool with the kids, but in doing so he gave up everything that made him special to begin with, his very identity. Was it worth it, Gravios? Are you even more popular now than you were before? I don't think so. But if history has taught us anything, it's that Gravios isn't the type to go down so easily. This monster is no stranger to rock bottom, and as the old saying goes, when you've hit rock bottom, there's nowhere to go but up, right? So for now, only time will tell where this infamous running rock of ours will end up next.
You do so much damage. What's it doing? Oh no! No, you ain't! That motherfucker killed me with that shit a while back! Make it stop! Andrew, I wish I can.